and that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. In this respect, I do believe that the approaches that have been made by some national laws are very, very valuable, because in that case, yeah, the truck driver that you mentioned will always have his national law to fall back on. Yeah, in that respect, there are some jurisdictions that already contain as law the principle that in case that you cannot that if you would follow a network approach,
Yeah.
and you cannot determine which unimodal regime to apply, then you need to be subject to the highest limit of liability, or to the highest liability that could be imposed upon you. Then, of course, you have the problem of the recourse gap. Again, can you make a back-to-back settlement? Again, another problem. And then,
but of course, but on the other hand, because if you don't have a contract, you might be subject to full liability.
yeah,
with no, because then you don't have any transport regulation at all, and then then it's general law of damages that you would have to apply. And I think maybe the Rotterdam rules, but what we eventually got there is it's basically exactly this. It might be seen as a failure because what they wanted was something different. But once they drafted this Article 82 with all the exemptions, then what you get in the end is this very regime where you have a backup clause or a gap filler for unlocalized damage.
That would be the pity is that then you would only have it to be applied to wet multimodal transport, but at least it's something, and something that could inspire perhaps a future attempt to regulate. The reality is completely different.
And I think you have MTOs where actually the cargo interests make them take on a higher liability than what mandatory law requires them to, so they can look after themselves. In a good way.
The situation is much more balanced, probably. But what do you think about the European? What did you think?
I think that during the last years, quite some time now, it has been quite controversial now, especially regarding the CMR convention that Paula mentions, because the scope of application rules of this convention are quite peculiar. And then you have so many different interpretations. Some jurisdictions say that you should apply the rules given for the longer leg. But then, what is longer? Is it about distance? Is it about time? Then you have other jurisdictions that say plainly, let's follow the network theory and let's try to localize the damage in every event. And then you have the soft law instruments that will allow you to deal with the unlocalized damage, like I explained before. And then you have other countries that simply fall back on their national law regime and say, this is a sui generis contract. So it's not a contract that could fall under road carriage nor under sea carriage. It should have its own rules. But then you can only follow this approach when you have extensive legislation in this respect, which doesn't serve of much when you cross international borders, which is basically every day in Europe. So those are the three approaches, and I fully agree with Paula that what you see in practice is that everyone tries to save their own transaction. And how do you do that? You contract your limits of liability, so you ensure that if there's no mandatory law, you have something to fall back on. Then, of course, it can be discussed whether they are valid or not, but you have a point to start a discussion. And also another aspect to take into consideration for these back-to-back settlements is to know beforehand what are the liabilities of your subcontractors. If you, as a multimodal transport operator, are going to subcontract a sea carriage, go and check the Hague Visby rules, check the terms and conditions of the sea carrier, and then you know what you can try and negotiate with your customer. So then you can have a back-to-back settlement. So yeah, there are so many ways to deal with it, and I fully agree with Paula that it's just easier to turn around and just try to make your transaction the best one and the most secure.
What can you tell us about this project that you have?
A project? I wish I could talk to you about the problems that have been encountered in the jurisdiction, unfortunately. Not so long ago, I was reading some case law, and it was still being discussed not so long ago whether multimodal transport could even exist, because there's this rule in the commercial code which states that for someone to be a multimodal transport operator, you need to be registered in a register which doesn't exist. So the question was whether the non-existence of this register would derogate the existence of multimodal transport. Now, thankfully, the Supreme Court said no, not in any event. Multimodal transport is recognized, and it is subject to the liability regime of maritime transport fully. So it doesn't, it doesn't have its own regime, but the code is very clear in respect that you need to apply the rules given for maritime transport. That facilitates the back-to-back settlements of the MTO with the sea carriers, of course. But yeah, that's as far as it goes, unfortunately.
But is that for
just the existent reality? I do believe that a convention could succeed, but only if it recognizes the existence of the unimodal regimes. So sort of accepting a network theory, but filling the gaps that this network theory doesn't allow you to fill by itself. Yeah. Or soft law instruments, I do believe that they can help a lot, even more maybe than an international convention, because if you have an international convention in this respect, you want it to apply mandatorily, but the reasons for it to be mandatory are not really there anymore. This is not the 1950s. So next to sufficient and complete soft law instruments could be a good way to harmonize and give predictability to this industry.
And soft law is probably quicker, because we see how long time it takes for international conventions. States are so anxious to someone else does the same thing. So it takes so much time that if there is soft law that appeals to the industry, I think they will be so much quicker to enforce it.
Yeah, although we need